Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fielka. Today is October 19, 2021. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast called I'm Probably Wrong About Everything. Thank you, Rob.
You're welcome. I'll see you guys later.
All right.
Okay.
And this is InnerViews number 10 with Beverly Gray. What a pleasure to see you, Beverly. Where are you calling in from?
I am calling from lovely Santa Monica, California.
Oh, isn't that cool? And I'm in Venice. How cool is
Yes.
that? So we're going to have a lot of fun. The first question is, Beverly, what's the best thing for a human being?
I think the best thing for a human being, not having thought of this previously, is to be satisfied with whatever he or she is allotted.
That is nice. Allotted. What a great word. It's like do what you can with what you got. With yeah,
Exactly.
beautiful. What's your favorite form of information? How it comes into you?
Okay. Well, I am a radio junkie. I listen to a lot of radio news. During the pandemic, I've rediscovered television, not so much for information, but for movies. I've discovered there's such a thing as a television miniseries. So those are two of my favorite forms. And of course, I read a lot.
Right. Let's go to reading just for a second.
Sure.
Did you grow up a reader because your parents were reading? They read to you or as an example or on your own?
Well, I'm sure it was my parents. I'm sure that they read to me. My mother, in particular, was a very conscientious parent and one who loved books and would do a lot of reading to me. And it's something I caught on to very early. It's a passion that's never left me.
Well, you sure are great at words. I've read some of your blogs today and
Thank you.
watched an interview with you on Popcorn Talk. You really have a talent of putting words together and being articulate and concise. So that's what we're all about. The second
That's
question
so
about,
nice. Thank you.
no, I'm
I
sincere.
appreciate
I'm
it. No,
really,
words for me are friends.
wow.
I love them. I spend a lot of time with them. And even one thing in my experience of living in foreign places and speaking foreign languages is how much I appreciate the English language and the fact that I'm good at it. Because however much I work at studying other languages, I know I will never be in that same place.
Wow. So why do you think humans collect or gather information?
Hmm. I think it's a form of treasure that doesn't take up space. It's it's something that we all can do, I would hope. Boy, this is a big question. Why do humans gather information? Uh, and to have information coming at you from other directions is, I think, one of the great pleasures of being alive.
Yes. Yes. So, do you think this need or want to collect information is more innate or more invented by humans?
Hmm. That's a big one, but of course, you've just made me think about it and realize that I suppose, well, I know that animals collect information, but they can't do it in the same way that we do. They can't collect the verbal in the same way, I would think, than we can. Or at least if they do, it's in some other alternative universe that I don't know anything about.
Right.
But whether it's innate, just I think the fact that we have the power of speech has a lot to say about who we've become.
Yes. So, do thoughts create emotions?
Do thoughts create motions or
Yeah.
emotion?
Emotions. Do thoughts create emotions?
Yeah, I think they do. I think thoughts can send you in a certain direction and kind of tell you how to react to it.
Yeah, this is interesting. Here's a few more questions just about thinking. And again, it's that nature and nurture kind of question. It's just in general, all these questions are more your hunch. So you really get this. It's like you're guessing if you don't feel you know. It's not like you have to know. I'm not trying to put you on the spot and say, what is your answer? It's more like just how you feel, your
Off the
impulse.
top of my head. Uh,
Off the top of your head, beautiful. Is thinking more innate or more invented?
I think it's innate, but one thing your questions have aroused in me is the fact that my grandparents on both sides would have spoken another language first. They were immigrants.
Yeah.
And for my parents, I think my mother has particularly articulated this. Uh, it was very important to speak English well. There was a little bit of embarrassment about having that other language around. Unfortunately, my parents were not encouraged to learn that other language. And they put a real premium on using the English language correctly. And I think the language you speak has to help forming your thoughts.
Really good. You're leading into these well. I don't know what I think until I fill in the blank.
I don't know what I think until I put it into my blog.
Very good. Well, you'll love the roots of this was McLuhan says, I don't know what I think until I've said it. And Joan Didion says, I don't know what I think until I wrote it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree with both of them.
Yes. Can humans think without language?
I've never tried, but I think that babies can think.
Yeah.
They must be thinking something and making connections. Otherwise, it's pretty dull being 18 months old.
Right. No, that's a great observation. These couple are new to my questions, so I'm having a lot of fun with it. No one said that because, you know, most people have been saying, yes, humans can think without language. A couple people go, no, we can't think without language. So it's sort of like, we're going to get into this later. It's like, what is your inner dialogue? Because we can have these things going on in our head and they're not necessarily in the form of a language. They could be something more abstract. So Chomsky says that language is not just words, it's culture, tradition, unification of community, a whole history that creates what community is.
Okay.
Beverly, how do you cope when language doesn't work? When
Oh, I
language
wanted I wanted to respond to the Chomsky
Oh,
quote.
please do, and
All
then we'll
right.
go into that. Yes, go
Yeah,
ahead.
I cannot pretend that Chomsky is in all contexts my favorite person, but I really do think that thinking has a lot to do with the language and the culture you're in.
Yes.
Uh, for instance, I was a student for a year in Japan in my college years, and I worked at the World's Fair in Osaka many more years than I care to think about. And I know that just the structure of that language, which is very different from a Western language, really has a lot to do with the way the Japanese see things in terms of hierarchy, respect, the fact that in Japanese, you normally aren't giving or receiving. You're giving to someone who's above you. You're giving to someone who's below you. There are things built into the language that tell you about relationships. Also, they have a great many words for saying I or saying you. It's not so sophisticated for us, but for them it is. There are all those possibilities that kind of indicate how old you are, what gender you are. I don't know how they've changed because all my information is a little antiquated at this point, but it's different. Definitely, if you were raised speaking Japanese, you would look at the world a little differently.
I really appreciate that. And I saw that picture of you on your blog. It's just gorgeous. People got to check it out. And all your links are right there. People can look it up. But it's wonderful. At what age are you there at the the U.S. Pavilion in Japan?
19, it was, I was 24 years old,
Oh, it's a
and
great picture.
I'm in a very short skirt. There's a whole story about the uniform, but what's really fun is within the last year, that picture was used to lead off an article I wrote about working at the World's Fair and in the and the space exhibit, which
Oh, that's where I saw it. That's a great article. People can find that. So, what I have observed so far, Beverly, is what you do is, as well as being articulate with words, and that's probably helps, is that you're a good listener. So I always open up, or often I open up the question with a cute little quote before the question, and then I ask the question. And rarely do people actually respond to the quote that much. It sort of sets it up. But this was the first time where someone said, well, wait a minute, let me respond to the Chomsky quote before I go to the question. So
well, good for me.
thank you for listening. It's a true skill in this day and age. I find that people will actually put their heart and soul into listening. It's a skill. So the
Look, I'm a
question,
mom. I got to do it.
there you go. Well, my favorite bumper sticker: question authority, but not your mother.
I've never seen that one. That's good.
That's a good one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Um, I'm a big fan of mothers. So, what do you do when language doesn't work? How do you cope, or what are your strategies? What do you do when language doesn't work?
You imply that I cope.
That is a great word too, cope.
What do I? Well, I can go berserk. I can holler. Uh, I I think I deal better with big crises than small ones. I can get really frazzled, and the number one area these days of crises for me is anything to do with technology. So
Yeah.
just the fact that we're talking here successfully to me is a major accomplishment.
Very good. So, do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
I think ultimately happiness, especially at this stage of my life, yeah, I want to be meaningful, but I want to do things that give me pleasure and give the people around me pleasure.
Yeah, beautiful. Actually, I wanted to go back to thinking. I flubbed on my script here. Your observations of humans, do you feel humans are more thinking beings or more feeling beings? Just in general. I know it's both and it depends on the context, but just generally.
Or thinking or feeling. Well, I'd like to be cynical and say that these days I don't think there's a whole lot of thinking that's going on.
Yeah.
Uh, so I guess I'd have to say that we're more feeling beings.
Yeah.
Thinking occasionally reins us in, but not so often these days.
Amazing. Yeah, it's amazing. So
And I
these are
think that we reward feeling in a way. I think that we look back at certain periods as overly rational, and we want people to be their authentic selves. And that can mean kind of acting out. In other words, to me, that means bringing the child part of you into your adult life, which can be good and creative, and it can be being a pain in the ass to everybody around you.
Wow, that's good. So you're saying I like that we reward people who are more feeling than thinking.
I
Is that
think
what you
so. I
Yeah,
think that
that's
is
an
so.
amazing observation. Yeah. These are two questions from 1950 by Alan Turing. Is thinking a function of the soul?
Hmm. I'm giving that one some thought.
Oh, you know what? Here's the other thing. Taking the time to think, there's no rush here. The beauty is we're just breathing and going with the flow. There's no pressure.
Oh, breathing is good. Yes.
Yeah.
Uh, Breathing a function of the soul. That, of course, depends how I define soul.
Yes, that's what's come up the most with this question is how people, what they think the soul is thinking a function of the soul. Yeah.
Well, I don't know that I can think about the soul without thinking. So I guess thinking has to be a function of the soul.
Oh my God, that's great. And then his second question was, can machines think?
Well, now I'm married to an engineer. So I think he probably is on the side of the machines. I, however, am an English major. So I think machines are intended to be our functionaries, and therefore they compute but do not think. I don't
Yeah.
think they're original thinkers. Now, Stanley Kubrick might disagree with me when he created HAL in 2001, but I don't think machines think. But of course,
Beautiful.
I'm thinking about that.
Well, that is it. Well, okay, does the brain more detect consciousness or create consciousness? Like, is consciousness there bubbling away and we're detecting it, or are we actually creating it?
Okay, say it again.
Is consciousness
Consciousness.
more um is it created by the brain? Do we make consciousness, or do we just detect it and it's there bubbling away like?
I think I'd like to think that it's there. It's part of what makes us human, and it's there from birth. So I don't think
Yeah.
we've created it, but we're certainly molding it and shaping it.
That's great. So I like when people change the verb. I said detect, and you say, no, we're molding and shaping consciousness. It's already there. There's a poet, Audre Lorde, she said, you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. Another great female poet and dancer, Yvonne Rainer, responded. She said, you can if you expose the tools. What new tool do you suggest?
Whoa. Okay. Well, I just want to know about the origins of the quote, which is totally unfamiliar to me. Is this
Well,
a political quote
she's
or is this a
yeah.
religious
So
quote?
so Audre Lorde's a poet, and she was saying you can't. She probably said this in the 60s and 70s, saying you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. It's sort of like this thing is, how can we change the world? Can we
Yeah.
use the same tools, or can we invent new tools? In fact, George Lakoff, the neuroscientist, says no, you got to use the old tools and the new and invent new ones. But I'm just saying, off the top of your head, what new tool, and that the funny word is new, do you suggest, or do you uh like favor at the moment in your life? One person said intuition. Now, the intuition isn't a new tool, but they sort of got, I'm after a big picture here. What tool do you suggest for people in general is really the question. What tool do you like?
Okay, these are not new tools, but maybe they could be used in new ways. I like imagination and I
Yeah.
like compassion.
Wow. Now, did you get that compassion from the way your parents raised you or on your own?
No, I think it was probably the way my parents raised me. And if we're talking political social here, I've got to give a shout out to them. I wish they were around to hear that shout out because when I was a small girl and my mother, who was pregnant with my sister, was looking for an interesting place to take me to do a new kind of thing, decided I should have dancing lessons. And she took me to your usual girly dance studio with tutus and pianos and all of that. And I was 4 years old. I would not have objected if she said, this is it. This is what it is. She didn't. She took me to a place called Lester Horton's Dance Theater, which was a place that in its day was very theatrical, very avant-garde, and as it turns out, extremely influential in the whole field of modern dance. That's where Alvin Ailey came from. That's where some other people came from who are important dancers and dance educators and things of that nature. And so she put me in this environment that was extremely multicultural, extremely diverse, just as a matter of course. And that was my first view of what people were like, really, to leave my neighborhood and to be in this other place, which took it for granted that there were people of different colors and different religions and different skin tones. And I've always been grateful that that was my first big introduction to social groupings. So I think you call that compassion.
That is beautiful. So well put. Did your parents raise you a particular religion?
Yes.
And are you still practicing?
I do.
And
Yeah.
do you pray?
Only in formal settings, and I don't pray in a formal, ritualized way aside from attending my own services. But I've got to tell you, I got some really bad news about a good friend today, and that makes you feel like praying.
Wow. My condolences or my prayers and thoughts are with you. And so, if God does exist, what would you like God to say to you after you die?
I think I'd like he or she or it to say to me, "You tried hard, you did a good job."
Yeah, that is beautiful. Tell me someone. Oh, no, I know what the next question is. Sorry. Can you conjure up your earliest memory or one of them?
Well, one of them is the birth of my sister. I remember standing outside of the old Cedars of Lebanon Hospital and throwing flowers, trying to reach my mother's window, which was impossible because it was a multi-story building and I was standing on the lawn and she was, up there somewhere. But that is certainly one of my early memories.
That is a beautiful memory. Do you think memory is more a curse or more a blessing?
I think it's a blessing.
Yeah.
Although I probably can remember every stupid, dumbass thing I've ever done, and I'm hoping that other people do not recollect some of the really embarrassing things that are lodged in my mind forever. But I love old song lyrics and poems and details, and I'm the one who remembers the lyrics of the play we put on in junior high school, because that's the way my mind works.
That is beautiful. I love that. Tell me an early role model, someone who had an impact on you, and it's two parts, within your immediate family and then outside your immediate family. And just briefly, and what was that impact? Specifically, how did they affect you?
Okay. Well, within my family, most of all, certainly it would be my parents. My mother was creative. She was endlessly devoted to her two daughters, would take us anywhere that something interesting was going on. I was always sorry for kids who didn't know about all the special things going on in Southern California because they weren't taken there by a mother who just wanted us to know the world we were in. So that was very special. My father was a role model in the sense that he was very much a family man, but also very ambitious. Coming from a very poor family, managed to get himself through college, managed to become a CPA, and then years later to go to law school while working full time. Passed the bar with flying colors on the first try. He was a guy who knew how to study, loved to achieve, and boy, that's where you learn study skills. He had a great powers of concentration and a great determination to get ahead. So if I'd ever felt like slacking off, that wasn't a good family to slack off in.
That was well put. And outside your immediate family, someone who had an impact on
Lots of people, of course, but I'll go back to those dancing schools. My first teacher at age 4 was a beautiful lady named Carmen de Lavalade, who went on to become quite a successful dancer and actress. She's still alive, thank goodness. She's still, as she says, I no longer dance, now I just move. But I mean, she's in her 80s. She received the Kennedy Center Honor a couple of years ago, and just being around a beautiful, gracious person like that, and a person from a very different culture from mine, was certainly formative.
Wow, that was so well put. Do evil people exist, or does evil use people as a vehicle?
Well, does evil use people as a vehicle? That sounds like evil is personified, like if you believe in Satan. I don't think I feel that medieval sense of evil, but certainly I think evil exists within people. There are certainly evil people out there, not just annoying people or misguided people.
This question deals with how we deal with enemies. So, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? This one I'm going to set up again with a few modern thinkers' thoughts. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. The great film director Coppola stole from the mob and the samurais. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. JFK said, forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name. And Fellini says, I need an enemy. Beverly, how would you advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you respond to the Alan Watts? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
I suspect that's true, but I don't think it's possible to pretend that that enemy doesn't exist or isn't out there, because I think we have too many examples in the world. But I'm reading a novel right now that certainly makes clear what it feels like to have enemies out there, and you can't simply pretend them away. What I'm reading about has to do with the pre-Holocaust years in Amsterdam, which is always Holland considered to be a good, civilized, decent country, and yet laws are being passed, things are happening, people are being disappeared. There are enemies, even though the characters involved, who were just average people up until that point, can't pretend it's not happening.
Right. So, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy?
Very carefully.
Very good.
I think I have one part of me is would like to be a little bit aggressive. I'm a small person, which means that I never want to be considered sort of a small person. And I just would like the idea of bopping someone in the nose and knowing that it's not going to work very well. Fighting back is something that part of me thinks is pretty attractive, but I know it's not always going to work. That my biting and kicking and scratching may produce no good results. So all the quotes about treating your enemies carefully, I think, are probably wise.
Are wise, beautiful. Are you more afraid of new ideas or more afraid of old ideas?
Of course, I could ask you what the new ideas are and what the old ideas are.
That's right.
They're
you put them into the context you want, and I know that's so general. It's sort of like your hunch in the big picture, But you again, putting them into the context you want, you can do that too. But it's just sort of
new ideas or old ideas. Well, I'd like to think that we are becoming more enlightened and therefore moving on to new ideas, and that the old ideas will gradually fade away. Uh, so I think despite it all, and this is maybe my father's inheritance, I tend to think that we're gradually, painfully, slowly improving, although some of the politics of the last few years have me questioning that. So,
Really well put. It's there. One question I've asked in the past is human progress cyclical or cumulative, and really what I've found is that we're going in circles, but it's like a cone. Sometimes we're circling upward, and sometimes we're circling downward. You know,
that
and
makes sense.
so what do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
Getting to sleep.
Very good. Now, James Joyce was the first projectionist. Finally, we can get into movies a little.
Okay.
James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin over 100 years ago. He basically
I
checked
didn't
out.
know that. That's
Yeah,
great.
Volta Cinema in Dublin. He said, "This is stupid. Why should I go?" He checked out. He says, "Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree?" Years later, Faulkner said, "Sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism." Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
Well, of course, I'm on the side of the arts here as somehow codifying, distilling, shaping, massaging, bringing things forward in a way that don't always hit us as we live, because we live life very piecemeal. We're experiencing things, as you said, all the time. We see trees all the time. I hope we see trees all the time. But an artist can make us see the treeness of that tree.
I love that word, treeness. Well, it's interesting. Let's delve a little deeper into this one. I don't usually do this, but I love your thinking process. And the poet Auden said, the mystery, or paraphrasing, he said, the mystery of art is that we don't really know if it activates or pacifies us. And so, can you comment on this? Like Bertolt Brecht said it similarly too. He said, I don't want art that puts you in a trance. I want art that activates you. Though me and you know, if we go to a movie and it puts us in a trance, that might be in the long run a way to activate us or to keep us involved in the world. So what do you find in your studies of how movies have shaped behavior? Just sort of talk a little about how they shaped your behavior and how they shape human behavior.
Okay, I was thinking about Brecht. I've never been convinced. I've read a certain amount of Brecht's theories, and I know he wanted people to leap up from the theater and feel impelled to do something somewhat specific. I've never felt, and I guess that's like Waiting for Lefty too, Clifford Odets, where he wanted everyone to jump out of their seats and yell, "Strike!" And there are some instances in which that can work, but I think mostly not. But as you say, the ideas that we see through artistic expression might sink in, swirl around us, be transformed by us. And I think they do affect our behavior, even though it's not that with that kind of hair trigger response that perhaps Brecht might have enjoyed. But I think movies do change us. And there was a time I was working on a project and I was asking an awful lot of people exactly that, which is why I'm happy we're talking about it, about how did movies shape you? Do movies change your life? And got a lot of small things that I think add up to a lot of big things. I mean, the classic example, of course, is it happened one night where Clark Gable took off his shirt and he wasn't wearing an undershirt, and all of a sudden sales of undershirts dropped dramatically. That's just what the stars wore and what they did with their hands and their smoking habits affected the way people lived. And of course, that seems quite true. A lot of people, I think, found smoking attractive because movie stars did it so gracefully or so dramatically. I once had the pleasure of talking at some length to Molly Haskell, the film critic, and we were talking, among other things, about Doris Day. And of course, part of the Doris Day mystique was the good girl, the girl who is smart and capable, but was not going to jump into bed with the guy until she had a ring on her finger, that the sort of social mores of that. But Molly Haskell told me that she, and she's of a generation earlier than mine, took away from Doris Day was, I want to be like Doris Day in the sense that I want to go to the big city and have a career and succeed at it. And that's how she saw Doris Day in the movies. She was always an ad exec or something like that. She was the capable female who was not the nice girl back at home in, I think, Virginia is where, I think Richmond, Virginia is where Molly Haskell's from. So that's one influence of the movies, helping you create your goals, helping you see what you wanted your life to be like. And then another piece I found really interesting when I went around asking that question, do movies change your life, is how many people had their sexuality not only shaped by what they saw in the movies in terms of the mores, the customs, what was appropriate, what was not appropriate, but also discovered things about themselves. And what this was interesting, I had a conversation with an editor at the New York Times, a very well-placed guy, and he said that he was 10 years old when Star Wars came out, and he went off to the movies to see Star Wars and suddenly realized in his 10-year-old mind that he was seriously, madly in love with Luke Skywalker. And that gave him a hint of the way his life was going to work and the way his sexuality was going to be oriented that he hadn't suspected before. But there it was on the screen, and it brought a message to him that it certainly didn't bring to me when I saw Star Wars. And when I told that story to another gay man, he said to me, for me, it was Romeo and Juliet. And when I realized in the sexual scenes that I was attracted to Romeo, that told me something. So I think for certain people, and I don't say this for myself, but for certain people, movies can be a confirmation of feelings that are lurking that they've never yet put a name to.
That was beautiful. So well put. There's so much that came up. One was funny is John Waters, the film director, said he rooted for the Wicked Witch of the West when he saw
I'm sure he did.
And I mean, there's so many others. A great poet at Beyond Baroque told me, I says, can movies really do anything? And he goes, yeah, if you're James Dean and you put your cigarette pack in your t-shirt like this, then all the kids will start doing it. And you just made another good example of that. Just underwear and clothing, fashion it has a big impact. But Sidney Lumet said movies can't do anything, but it ain't going to keep me from trying. So in actually persuading people to think a certain way, it's very interesting. I mean, we just go to the great Preston Sturges when they go into that film. I think it's called Sullivan's Travels. Yeah, you got to make a movie that helps the working man, and I'm going to go work with the working man. And thank God for screwball comedy, because maybe if we laugh, we learn a little more than if we're just being hit sledgehammered.
That's a great example. I love that example because, of course, what he thinks is going to help people, the serious intense didactic drama isn't what's going to help them, but a good laugh perhaps is what's really going to help them in their hour of need.
Right. But it's also a phenomenon I've always studied is, do movies create false expectations? And that's a little too biased way to ask it. But like, I remember my mom coming over in my house one day and saying, I want to watch Clockwork Orange. I'm like, why? I couldn't figure out why she wanted to watch that. And she was like, hey, it's making a big splash in pop culture. There must be something behind it. And you can go, well, does a violent film, which I just sort of hate violent films, does a violent film alleviate you of your human need to be violent, or does it cause you and create you to want to be violent? Does it encourage it? So that the word confirmation was really helpful in you explaining this to me about the gay in the Star Wars, in the Romeo and Juliet. But what do you think of something like violence? Just your big, I know it's a big question, but does it more contribute to desensitizing us about violence, or does it alleviate us of that need? So it's like helping us.
Well, that's a multi-pronged question. And first,
Yeah.
I want to find out how your mother liked A Clockwork Orange.
I wish I remembered, because since then I've delved so deep into studying Kubrick. I was fortunate enough to interview James Harris, who worked with him on like 8 films, and that was truly an enlightening time, because it was all the same questions I'm asking you. But I would imagine what we did afterwards is we had a discussion about violence, and that's what I think was the most important thing, that the film can not only be something to confirm feelings, but can stimulate your thought, and you can take it farther. I always say the movie doesn't end when you walk out of the theater. The movie keeps resonating if you keep talking about it.
Well, the reason I was so interested when you brought up A Clockwork Orange is because I remember very distinctly seeing that movie. In fact, I saw it at the Grauman/Man/whatever, the Chinese theater.
Right.
And I have, everybody is, the really hideous rape scene, which is also a very funny scene. I have never felt so female and vulnerable in my life. That movie really came at me from the screen, just making me kind of glance around at all those people who were laughing and finding it funny. And I'm not saying this makes it a good film or a bad film, but certainly it was a film with a great deal of immediacy for me. When I saw that woman being violated in such a grotesque way, yeah. It really shook me up. So maybe your mother has a stronger stomach than I do. Now, given that I worked for Roger Corman for many years, of course, I've had a certain experience with film violence, and I'm usually not too squeamish, because if I were, I would have had a really hard time doing my job. But I know, and of course, we defended those films, which certainly had their share of blood, although usually not quite as cynically as A Clockwork Orange. But certainly from the beginning of the film industry, just about, Congress and various government bodies have been trying to argue that movies shape people's behavior for the worst, and that they therefore shall be censored. And of course, we have the whole Hayes office, whatever you'd call it, with the various rules about outcomes that were not acceptable, and language that couldn't be used, and implications that couldn't be made. And we all know that that form of censorship didn't work very well, because it didn't make the film seem anything like actual life.
Well, it's
Well, it's
amazing.
amazing.
You
Oh,
brought
You
up
brought
the
up the
Corman in
Corman in
Death Race
Death Race
2000
2000.
is Paul Bartel's a brilliant film, and it's both comical and sort of satiristic, but it's also violent. I remember one scene that I really cringed. But tell us, just an aside, because I know, what was the added part that, do you get credit for adding the ending, or it's uncredited?
oh, it's uncredited, of course.
And tell
But
us specifically what you suggested, and you suggested it directly to Paul, and he said yes.
well, just part of a story conference, and we were trying to think of how to end the film. And I said, well, I think that's obvious. I think that we've come to love this violent hero who scores points by running over people, although he's chosen to only run over people who are pretty hideous people. So there's a moral choice involved in any case. And I said, well, it's obvious since this country is under the rule of Mr. President, who's making the rules. I said, it's obvious that he's going to score the president. And everyone said, yeah, that's it. So now that I spoiled the ending for everybody, but
No, I think they'll still rush out and see it. The
well, I hope
original
so.
Death Race 2000, please.
I'll tell you something interesting about Death Race 2000. I remember very, very distinctly, because this is, as I said, I have a good memory. A Roger bought a story called The Racer, which was written by Ib Melchior. And he bought it around the time that the big studio was making Rollerball. So, in other words, this was a standard Roger Corman thing to take something that he thought was going to be a cultural phenomenon, in this case, a deadly futuristic game, and make something that will interest the same people and maybe be in the on the marquee sooner, etc. So Rollerball's being made. Roger buys the short story called The Racer, and in the story, the character, and of course the point of Death Race 2000, as opposed to the much later Death Race movies, was that you score points like in that nasty children's mental game, playground game of how many points for the pregnant nun, that sort of thing. So that was in the story, but within this little short story, the main character has suddenly a crisis of conscience and decides he can't do this anymore. Well, that was not very interesting. And we got a writer named A.E. Van Vogt. Now, I'm not a science fiction reader, but apparently he was known in science fiction circles. And he came in, and I remember he was a very middle-aged guy. I was pretty young at the time, and he was wearing this houndstooth jacket. And we were all interested to hear his ideas about how he was going to take this little story and make it into a film. And he said, well, of course, we don't want the idea of our hero running over people for points. So what I've figured out is that there's going to be a device on the dashboard of the cars that's scrambling the racer's brains, so he really can't help himself, and therefore unconsciously he's doing these terrible things, but it's not really him at all. And we all looked at each other and said, you know, this guy doesn't have the spirit of the whole thing. He doesn't quite get it. At which point we moved on to Chuck Griffith, who was very happy to take this grotesque idea. But what drives me a little crazy now, or at least amuses me, is that Roger Corman, who is now in his 90s, is very happy. He didn't like the movie when it was made. He tried to cut all the humor out of it until he discovered that that's what people really liked, the very, very dark humor. But nowadays, not only does he say that he put all the humor into the film, but that he thought up the idea of the points. I guess that's not only Roger, and he's not the only guy in Hollywood who's taken credit for something that was not really deserving, but he thinks he invented all of that.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, because these anecdotes fill out history's gaps. And that's what I like about history, that it can constantly be evolving and people can get the bigger picture if they talk to more sources. So, Beverly, we appreciate that and appreciate all your books. Your Corman book is astounding. So, let's go back to your roots a little. What, because I know you, and you've talked about this on your popcorn talk on YouTube, that's very good about fleshing out your career, but I'm curious what first attracted you to pursue theater? Because I know you pursue English in literature, but what was the kickover? Like you're seeing live plays or you're seeing plays on TV or movies and saying, I want to do that.
Okay. Well, first it was dancing, as I'm sure I've made clear.
Yeah.
And then after some years at Lester Horton's, I was about 10 years old. We went to local uh, recreation center, and there was a drama class. And I wasn't succeeding in the way that I like to succeed as a dancer. So drama seemed like a good segue. And I love drama. I was always involved in it. I usually had good parts. I was quite confident and had a lot of fun. And in high school, I was juggling two things that I loved in addition to academics. I love drama and I love journalism, but the journalism teacher was kind of a pill, so I opted for drama. So all through high school, I was very involved with drama. But I knew quite well that I probably didn't have the tools to be successful as an actor. I loved doing it, but it wasn't anything that I was going to really succeed at. And meanwhile, moving into a college level academic environment, I thought, this is it. This is what I want to do. I want to, be the intelligent, intellectual, but cool professor, introducing people to great works of art. And that throughout my college years was what I was really focused on, up through the PhD. And that's where I thought I belonged. I'm probably not answering your question exactly right,
No,
but
no, it's a through line you're following well because it's sort of like I'll ask this question and we'll dig in a little deeper. Is like a screenwriting teacher told me a great film or great art, great theater, great book is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Kubrick says the opposite. Great film or great art is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. What role does intention play in your creative process? So you can stretch it from the many films you were a story consultant on to your own books. Talk about intention in that in those that your creative process in your output over the years.
well, I'll tell you a secret that I have, I think, 6 screen credits as a screenwriter. I don't think of myself as a screenwriter. I think I know a lot about screenwriting. I think I'm very good at judging other people's work and nurturing it, bringing it along, sometimes finishing it up. But the making up of stories, I think, is not my strength. I leave that to other people. Uh, I love working with things that are there and bouncing off of them, whether it's literary criticism, whether it's biography. So I'm dealing with facts. So there's that sense of plunging into details that exist. And then bringing what I hope are my skills as a writer to those details and those thoughts and organizing them into a kind of a coherent whole. So I would say that's my process. But making it up, some of my students I'm in awe of because of the way they can come up with something out of whole cloth. That's not what I do.
Beverly, Marcel Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. When you're writing, how much are you thinking of your audience or your readers?
Uh, I was just thinking of a quote from Nabokov who said, I write for myself and hope for hundreds of little Nabokovs. I don't think I'm quite as self-centered as that, but I'm comfortable with my writing. I'm comfortable with my style, and it seems to touch some people a lot. Of course, I'd like to touch more people, but uh, people seem to affix themselves to what I write. That's one of the fun things about my blog, which is, in a way, my blog is strictly for me. It's a rehabilitation exercise that I started when I was really at a dead end in terms of writing. A project had fallen through. I was very depressed. And I said, I've got to cheer myself up. And that's when I started blogging. And it's been going on for 10 years now. And there's been one book since I started all that. But sometimes it becomes a conversation because certain people I know are reading, some people write back, and I love that. So I'm writing for them. I'm writing, I suppose, for a kind of an ideal reader, but not a snooty reader. I've come to the point, after having been in academics for so long, that I loathe academic writing. I think it's stuffy. Maybe it's because when I got my first, what seemed like a dream job, which turned out not to be, and then they hired me because they said they loved my writing. And then a few years later, they said, well, you don't really sound like an academic. And I thought that was probably a flattering description, although I know it was not meant as such. I just like words.
Well put, Beverly. You are well spoken with words, and you can write them too, because there is a difference between spoken word, printed word, and electronic word. So in the world of electronic word, 10 years of doing a blog is amazing because it becomes a two-way thing. People can write back to you, but they're typing. They're not calling you on the phone or talking to you in person in a classroom. But let's go to education just for a second. And I feel the same way about academia. I mean, even McLuhan said there's a difference between education and entertainment, and what pleases us teaches us more. So, in the big picture, is entertainment teaching us more than education? Well, it's a debatable subject. If you were to be in charge of education in some way nowadays, how would you want it to be? What would your means of teaching people, or I don't even know how to word the question, but you pretty much get it. What's a suggestion you have to improve education?
I have only taught at the college and post-college level, and what I teach now is an advanced screenwriting workshop. And I think the best thing in that context, which I can give students, is, in a way, my voice, even though for the last many years, I've taught only online, not on Zoom as we're doing, but in writing.
Yeah.
But just a human connecting with another human, I think, is the key for me. I'll give you an example. The other day, so I teach through the writers program at UCLA Extension, which is a very good and very serious program. And we instructors had a retreat, a Zoom retreat, where an authority spoke to us. And I realized that she had a lot to say and a lot of good ideas, but she came from a very formal academic context. Well, first of all, it was the title of her talk had something to do with anti-racism. So right away, I was a little leery about wanting to reform the way we think about things at the same time that we're teaching writing. And everything she said, I had to kind of translate into human terms. And I think she was a good teacher. I think she had, I think her thoughts about letting students do what they wanted without remodeling their minds and giving them the freedom. I mean, all of that was absolutely right, but she spoke about it in such a formal academic way uh, that I felt I was listening to her through a scrim, that I had to, it's just not the way I want to talk. And I realized that not staying in academia actually was a boon to me because, and maybe academics have reformed over the years. Maybe they're not all stuffy, but some of them surely are and take pride in it, I think.
Yeah, it's a great suggestion. What you're basically saying is it should be more one-on-one human contact. McLuhan called it the city as classroom. That you can go out into the city and learn, and you don't have to go into a classroom and be taught by a human being that's like so structured. But you did mention previous you
I
had
want to say,
some.
I got to say something
Yeah.
that McLuhan himself is not that easy to read.
Oh, totally. He's a court jester, a charlatan. He's a poet. We've studied him deeply, but that is indeed very true what you just said.
But can I tell my
But
McLuhan story now?
oh yeah, that's exactly what I was leading to.
Yeah,
I'd love
okay.
to hear it.
All right. Well, maybe you won't think it's as funny as I did. But this story goes back to 1970 when I was working at the World's Fair. And it was toward the end of the fair. We were all getting a little loose and a little tired and a little crazy. And somebody had mentioned that not that far from where we lived, there was kind of a little national park. In Japan, the national parks, or at least this one, was not as formal and as large and as grand as they might be here. But it was a public park which had its own little waterfall. So I went to see the waterfall. I was dressed very casually, and I was going to be going from there to my job at the fair. So I had, a change of clothes and underwear and all those things. Got to this waterfall, and it was a hot day. And I said, "Wow, I know this is crazy, and this is sort of contrary to anything that most Japanese would think of doing, but I think I'm going to go swimming in the waterfall. It's a nice pool, wasn't dangerous." So I did that. I left this tote bag I had on the side, and in the tote bag were, underwear, ID, money, the basic stuff you carry around, plus a copy of a compendium of Marshall McLuhan's writing. So I went swimming in the waterfall, and I think everyone gaped and pointed at me and thought I was really a hennagaijin, a strange foreigner. And all of a sudden, while I was swimming around, a monkey came down from the mountain, grabbed my tote bag, rummaged through it, grabbed something, and ran off up the hill. And I realized what he had grabbed was my Marshall McLuhan book. So I chased, got out of the water, ran up the hill, chased the monkey, rescued the book, uh, which survived. And here it is.
Oh my God, the hot and cold. I figured that's what it was. That
Yeah.
is a great story.
Yeah,
I
it
can't
survived pretty well, considering.
I can't wait to tell. I've had a relationship with Eric McLuhan, Marshall's son, who died about a year ago. And then his grandson, Andrew McLuhan's really upholding the McLuhan tradition well. And Andrew was a punk rocker a little from Canada. In one show he played, it ended and there's a mosh pit where everybody dances. And he looked down and there was a copy of Understanding Media on the floor of a mosh pit in a punk rock bar. And
Oh,
he will love this story. This is such a great story. And it's beautiful how you told us too. And so this is a phenomenon I'd love for you to comment on. Michael Apted, I spoke with him about 40 years ago, the great director, and he had made a documentary on a Russian rock star. And I said, why do rock video editors feel so obliged to edit fast? Now, most people don't know Abel Gance probably invented rapid montage in 1922, but it really became prominent in the birth of MTV 40 years ago. And even Marty Scorsese was cutting his films faster. He says, I cut my films faster because of MTV. And Michael Apted said, well, it's because we've learned to take in information faster. So the question is, Beverly, and I ask it with a bias, can humans literally learn to take in information faster, or are we just brainwashed to believe we can?
I think we are. I think we are conditioned. I remember when Sesame Street was new, we were told that that was going to be dangerous for kids because it was pushing ideas out very fast. And early TV, I also remember Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. Just that kind of quick tension and release, the quick joking is something, is a rhythm that seems to match our modern life. Now, maybe it would be nice to be a little slower, but maybe we'd be happier if we were a little slower. But I do think we're taking in information. That doesn't always mean we're putting it to good use, but I think we are catching it more quickly.
Great verb. I appreciate that. In the sort of hidden question there is it literally possible for humans to multitask?
Well, we're told that in fact there is a limit to multitasking, in that we shouldn't try to file our nails and drive a car and talk on the phone, etc. And I believe that that's sort of crazy and dangerous, but we're all trying to do it. And I think for me, having been a wife and a mother and a grandmother and having all these things going on while I'm juggling, I think women, or at least women who are in charge of children, know very well that multitasking is something you have to do, that you haven't a choice. And I always love it when people ask me questions about my writing process, and they say, oh, do you have 3 hours in the morning where you sit down and you write? And maybe I'd have to if I were a fiction writer. I don't know. Maybe you'd have to build up that kind of head of steam. But I find I've never had the luxury to stop and to write without interruption, that I'm always stopping and starting, that I have no choice in the matter. So maybe that's affected the way I write or what I write, but it's something I can do because I feel I have to.
Really well put. And I appreciate you sort of having ESP, because you led right into this question. A couple of my heroes, I come from the experimental film world. George Manupelli started the Ann Arbor Film Festival 60 years ago. And cinema's only about 130 years old, so it's pretty amazing it's lasted that long. His mantra is ignore yourself. Jonas Mekas says there is no self-expression. And great jazz pianist Cecil Taylor says, I'm just a vehicle and this stuff just comes through me. So you sort of touched on this question in what you just said. And I know it's both and it depends, but is art making, filmmaking, writing more self-expression or more a vehicle for whatever culture or technology is dominant?
Can I say both? I was just thinking.
Oh, yeah, you can say both, definitely. You can say whatever you want, sure.
I was just thinking, wait, I'm going to turn on a light. I see that I'm going into darkness here, and that's depressing. Look at that. Fiat Lux. That I remember I always wrote longhand. I come from the era, and I'm sure you do too, where you laboriously typed a college paper, and if you made a mistake, you went through all kinds of hoops to change some little word. And suddenly, it never would have occurred to me to write on a keyboard. I always used a pen and crossed out and made notes, and it took a bit of mental adjustment to be able to write as I do now, on a computer keyboard and change as I go. So I have forgotten what the question was,
Well,
but
the question is, it's good that you brought that up. It's really how much does the culture and the technology affect the artist? And we want to say it's self-expression, but maybe it's just. I'll give you a couple examples. Rap artist Missy Elliott says she learned how to sing from car alarms. Now, we would, this is the culture and the technology around her. James Brown's drummer said he got the essence, the architecture of funk drumming because in Ohio he lived in a house where one side of his house was a factory and the other side was a train track. So it really established this rhythm in him that's sort of like funk drumming. So you hear this. So
I was going to add that having visited Motown not too long ago and gone to the spot where it was created, a lot of those people came from a culture where everyone worked in the auto factories. And so the assembly line had a lot to do with not only their methods, but even some of their rhythms.
yeah.
So, that is certainly part of what's going on.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I imagine that I write differently on a keyboard and than I would with a pen. I imagine that there's something different going on there.
yeah. And the real hidden question is, can the creative process be egoless? Can art making be egoless?
It may depend on. I'm not a musician. I can't speak for musicians. I mean, that's considered the most abstract of arts. Uh, perhaps maybe it can if it's a matter of composing music. I don't think writing with words can be egoless. And I'm not sure if this is relevant or not. I'm always, they always say to read your work aloud, and I don't, but I do, because I'm always listening to what I'm writing. I can't write with music or the TV or something else going on in the background because I'm always not aloud, but I'm always hearing my words. That's very important to me. And even something like my Beverly and Movie Land blog, which twice a week for 10 years, before I post it, I'm going to reread it again. I'm going to continue changing it and tweaking it. I can't say that's egoless. It's I'm hearing it. I'm seeing the rhythms of it. But certainly my mind and my tastes are shaping it.
Really well put, Beverly. Thank you so much. And in your blog, for having done it for 10 years, tell me one major element that you think has changed and one major element that stayed the same.
Okay. Well, this is not a very interesting answer, but one thing that's changed, we're always looking for something good to come out of COVID. And for me, one of the somethings good was I've discovered watching television. I used to write pretty strictly about movies I had seen in a movie theater. I've discovered, I watched all of Mad Men. I watched all of Breaking Bad. So those are new dramatic forms that I never got into when my life was structured differently and there was a lot less time couch sitting. You wanted one thing that's changed and one thing that stayed the same.
Yeah.
Well, I have to say my love of language, and the blog for me is a very personal form of expression. I remember back in college when I did some journalism and I was used to writing in the third person, and you kept the authorial I out of it. And in academia as well, you pretty much kept the ego obviously it was there, but you removed it from the language. I at this point in my life, I want to be me, and so I want to talk about interesting things, but filtered through my sensibility, my sense of humor, my past experience.
Beautiful.
People reading it.
So,
Uh,
a poet said that poetry is outing your inner dialogue. What language is your inner dialogue in? We sort of touched on this earlier. Like, we all have this sort of conversation inside our mind or brain. What form is that in? What language for you?
well, I don't think you want me to say English, but uh, I am one of those people who've always, and I came across this in a novel or a short story collection by John Barth once, where the narrator says he'd always told the story of his life in the third person as he went along. And I think I do some of the same. I've always kind of retold the more interesting facts of my life in language. So I'm not sure I could say what language it is, but
You mean it's sort of like a voiceover track in a movie?
yeah, it really is.
That's great. So, is perception reality?
I think perception is reality, except you have to keep in mind that everybody else has a different perception and therefore an overlapping reality. Uh, so there's a lot of different realities out there.
Yeah.
And of course, that's the other thing to do with memory is that you can remember something incredibly clearly, and in many cases I do, and then discover that it didn't quite happen that way at all. So there's a certain fallibility to memory.
In film studies, we know that as a Rashomon effect, and McLuhan
Absolutely.
updated McLuhan updated the medium is the message, medium is the massage, mid-career to the user is the content. So I would say all art is no longer the artist once they release it to the public. The public can do whatever they want with your art, you know.
That's
So
true.
yeah. So Moshe Feldenkrais works with healing and movement. He says it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength rather than we're normally taught to overcome a weakness.
Hmm.
Tell me a weakness you've turned into a strength.
Oh boy. Well, I'm super sensitive and I'm very short. And I used to tell people that I was disappointed with life because I wanted to play basketball. But at 5 feet, I wasn't going to make it. But sometimes that's being small as I am has led to some difficult moments and some advantages. One, both. I always felt like somebody's kid for many years. Now I don't think that sounds so bad. But when I first taught at USC and was trying to be dignified and grown up, and people were going around and saying things like, "Doesn't she make a cute little professor?" Didn't help. Really didn't help. So I've always wanted to be taken seriously, and I wanted to walk tall, and I try.
It's beautiful. What's more important, conviction or compromise?
Can't tell you what's important, but it's good to have convictions, but without compromise, you're obnoxious.
Wow. I love that word. That was great. Lewis Carroll says, I believe as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Have
Well,
you
actually,
believed?
Alice said it.
Oh,
No,
yeah,
wait,
you're right. There you go. Alice said it.
no,
Thank
did
you.
Alice say it, or did one of Alice's cohorts say it?
Well, now you got me tricked because I just credit the author of the book, but have you believed in any impossible things lately?
Oh, I don't want to get political again. Uh, well, I'd like to think that I'm going to publish another book, but I'm beginning to wonder. It's seeming kind of impossible at the moment.
Well, we'll look forward to it. I think your books are important. How about this one? Anger can be a productive emotion when fill in the blank.
Anger can be an important,
A productive emotion
productive emotion when
when.
you channel it into energy and imagination.
Right. What's the most significant difference between men and women, physical aside?
Oh, well, obviously, it would not be nice of me to generalize about all men and all women. Uh, so I will think about me and my husband. Uh, I think I'm more sensitive to nuance and more understanding of relationships.
Very good. And how many years have you been together?
49.
Congratulations. I really look up to people. You know, from our era, our parents seem to stick together for the long haul, and less people our age have made it through. And I really appreciate that. And I was wondering, how do you explain your longevity?
Um, well, there have been moments, but uh, I think we're very different. We're very different in what we're good at. We're somewhat different in what we like, our enthusiasms. I think we're able, have had to learn to give each other ground, to share and to respect most of the time.
Yeah, that's beautiful. How do you find peace of mind?
Peace of mind. I'd love to say I meditate and do also. Uh, I love to dance. I like to just move. First thing in the morning, I'm sort of a zombie standing very still, not thinking of anything in particular. I also like to go to beautiful and interesting places, and
Yeah,
that's harder to do these days.
that's beautiful. There's a saying that goes, if you can't say it, sing it. If you can't sing it, dance it. I
Yeah,
think dance
I
is
like
such an
that.
important thing. It's so much getting in touch with your body and breathing.
Well, that's another thing, and I didn't even realize it, but my son says that I am singing and humming all the time. And I didn't know that until it was called to my attention. Uh,
It's like your natural movement, your natural beat.
yeah.
Um, if you were walking down the street today and you met yourself as a 12-year-old, what would you say to your 12-year-old self?
12. Okay. Well, one cynical thing I would say is that when you think something is perfectly, absolutely meant to be, that the universe has planned it for you, forget it. It's not going to work out that way. but I would also hope I would tell my 12-year-old self to take satisfaction where you can.
Yeah. Yeah, you seem to be more an optimist than a pessimist. Would you agree or?
Mm. I think I basically am. I think I came from an optimistic family, but if you were to ask me about certain things happening in our country right now, I would get pretty morose.
Yes. Well, I'm curious about your um, your journey in tackling The Graduate. It was such an important film, and you did such a thorough job in exploring it. What did you learn from delving so deep into that, researching that movie? What are some of the main things you learned, like about yourself and about life in general and philosophies? And
Well, I approached The Graduate initially by way of a book that didn't happen for various reasons about the year 1967 at the movies. It was a very important year. It was the year not only of The Graduate, but Bonnie and Clyde, Cool Hand Luke, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, In the Heat of the Night. The whole industry was changing, and at least at that point, it was changing in a way that brought to our attention strong movies that had strong things to say about who we were, where we lived, what our culture was all about. So that's what attracted me to The Graduate among these other films. And when, for various reasons, I had to narrow the focus, I chose that one because it seemed like, and was intended to be, a small, funny, sexy movie. And yet I think it spoke volumes to, particularly to my generation, which at the time was a young generation. That it, even though when you stop to think about it, it had nothing specific to say about life in 1967. In fact, one of the things I learned from talking to the producer, Larry Turman, was that nobody planned for this movie to be about the here and now. They were kind of envisioning it being set in the early 60s, which is when the source novel was set. But it was a novel that hit all of us of the Vietnam generation as our movie, even though it has nothing to say about Vietnam. And it has nothing to say about all of the issues that were bubbling up, that were dramatically bubbling up in the late 1960s. And what I learned from my own perspective is how much, even though my own circumstance was certainly nothing like Benjamin Braddock's, and I'm not even of the same gender as Benjamin Braddock, and I wasn't going to run off with the bride, but that I understood that character, and I understood him from my own place in the world, which was as someone graduating from college, having loving but slightly interfering parents who thought they had my future all mapped out. So that was the part of The Graduate that struck me. And what I discovered in the course of talking to many people is how many of them found in that film something that spoke to them about what this was saying about their issue, or their issues in the multiples, including one woman who was not looking at Benjamin and identifying. She was looking at Mrs. Robinson and seeing a cautionary tale and saying, I don't want my adult life to go the way that one did. So there were people who were really molding themselves on the lessons that they learned from that film. And no one expected it. It wasn't really what was planned out, which I think is maybe part of the reason it worked so well. It's not didactic, but it hit that nerve that a lot of people were feeling in the late 1960s.
that goes back to intention in filmmaking. McLuhan has a great line: the Balinese have no word for art. They do everything as well as they can. And they had their hunch that this film could pull together. Do you think that the success can be, I don't want to say blamed, but more credited to Mike Nichols, or you studied all the elements of the film? I mean, there's various elements, the casting, even the Simon and Garfunkel song at the end, and the acting and the screenwriting. Who, how do you sort of navigate who's most to
What?
credit?
Well, of course, that's the thing about filmmaking. It's a collaborative process, but Mike Nichols had a heck of a lot to do with it.
Yeah.
Uh, Larry Terman, the producer, had a lot to do with picking Mike Nichols. And Nichols, who it was going to be his first film as a director, it ended up being his second. His first being Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. But just his sensibility seemed to work so well with that particular material. He's the one who found Buck Henry. And one thing I think that really helped the film was that all three of these guys, Terman, Nichols, Buck Henry, saw Benjamin Braddock as themselves. They identified strongly with this character. They felt they knew him. He wasn't exactly the character in the novel. He certainly had the external elements, but was a little more likable, a little more approachable. A guy who was an adult but didn't quite want to be. He wasn't sure that he should be and didn't know in what direction to go with this newfound adultness. They all got that. So it was a coming together of people who were really on the same team.
Yeah. Yeah, that collaborative effort, but you really summarized it well there. So I asked for 90 minutes. We're going over a couple minutes. Beverly, it's been truly enlightening, and I really appreciate how articulate you are. I have one more question, but we'll see if Rob wanted to join in. He might be there, and I might be able to ask one more. If he doesn't pop in, then I'll just ask. Oh, go ahead, Rob. You're there.
This
Good.
is exciting. It's kind of like the Wizard of Oz.
Question authority, but not your mother. Yeah, that's my favorite bumper sticker. So, Rob, do you have a question before we close out here? Thank you again for facilitating this.
Thank you. Sorry, I switched over, so I sent a comment when I didn't mean to. But you're talking about The Graduate, a film that's over 50 years old that people still talk about. Now, I haven't seen it, but I know it well enough to understand the premise of it.
Okay.
But I have to see it now. So I guess this is a twofold question. The first being, what film in recent history is going to have a similar impact that The Graduate did on our sort of on culture that The Graduate did in 50 years? So I mean, I ask people questions like Marvin Gaye's album, What's Going On? That album is 40 years old. What album today will have the same impact? So for The Graduate, what film nowadays do you think will have a similar impact in 50 years' time?
You know, I'm going to duck out of that one and say I think movies meant more to people then. I think there were less opportunity in other fields to connect in the way they did with movies. That's one thing I strongly feel, that people are perhaps more bound up with television, with certain miniseries. I would like to be able to think of a movie that had that kind of power, that on the one hand fascinated a politician and a Catholic brother, and a SDS radical, and all those people that I spoke to who were transformed. I don't think there is a movie that fits into that category, and I wish I could think of one. But I think we're divided more into our particular interest groups, that we're off in all directions.
I'll give it, Rob, before you ask your next question, I'll just give you an example. When Avatar came out, it was the most expensive film ever made in movie history. James Cameron's a pretty good filmmaker. It was anti the man and pro Mother Nature. So it had a great message. Is like, could this movie get over the way you're asking? Like, could that become a Graduate 50 years down the road? and people would come out of the movie and go, great special effects. Now, I know it affected some people a little different, but it's sort of like when you
Right.
study the history of storytelling in cinema, it's what becomes the dominant thing, the special
Yeah.
effects, the spectacle of it, or the story they're trying to say. So I think Beverly put it well that, let's
Oh,
hope that,
you answered my question.
Oh,
yeah,
well, I was just trying to think, and I wouldn't have thought of a movie like Avatar having that kind of impact anyway, because as you say, it's the big special effects movie. It's the smaller, more personal movie that I think has that, you'd think, possibility, but we're so divided into our own groups. I thought of a movie like Lady Bird, which certainly
yeah,
to young people, particularly young girls, would really identify with that, but I don't think it crosses over
yeah.
into the culture in a way that these earlier movies did.
For me, it's Lion King. Lion King made me a Shakespeare fan, and I'm a capitalist for Disney, I guess you could say. So, my next question is the age old question: does life imitate art, or does art imitate life? And the follow up to that, this is my last thing, is that, well, what does that mean today? So, what does the imitation play out as today?
Does life imitate art? Well, I think it's reciprocal. So life imitates art, that imitates life. Um, I'm Eras are so important, aren't they? I suddenly started thinking about Hamilton, which in its way, in terms of the theater, the live stage, has had a tremendous social / political impact, not only in its story, but in its casting, in the way it shapes the American story. It's been pretty powerful. I can't say in the way that The Graduate is powerful. It's not so much a personal story as a cultural story. But I think they've done a great job of spreading that through the culture, not only on the stage, but through the televised version. But in terms of a movie that's on everyone's lips, as The Graduate was, both pro and con, I'm just not coming up with anything.
Well, this has been truly enlightening. Thank you so much, Robin. Thank you, Beverly. Last question is, what gives you the most optimism?
Well, I think I'm going to go corny and say kids right now are evolving. In some ways, that has me worried because given what they've been through in the last year, and I talk as a grandma, and have heard statistics about how many have been mentally displaced by what we've all lived through in the past year and a half, 18 months. But as long as kids keep being born, there's an automatic kind of optimism in new people coming into the world if we can, I suppose, treat them right and raise them right and hold on to the glories we've got and make them see them.
Beautiful. That's the answer we get the most. So that's very encouraging that we can look to the youth for optimism. Beverly, thank you so much. Thanks for all your books and all in your blog, but most of all, thank you for your spending your time with us and being so dang articulate.
Thank
And
you,
it was
Beverly.
really wonderful. Thank you so much.
It was lovely. I've had a very good time, although I am not sure I'm the person to pontificate on the meaning of life, but it's nice of you to ask.
You did great. You
Sounded pretty confident.
Yeah. Thank you, Rob. Bye. Thanks, Beverly.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.